what I would like to do is step back and think about how things have evolved over the last 30 years, 20 to 30 years, and use that as a way to understand where we are now in this somewhat puzzling time. For me, at least, it has been a long, strange trip. And the experience with the tech revolution has been, as I indicate, ambiguous. It's clearly had benefits. I want to point to some problems that have emerged as well and suggest some new directions we can pursue going forward. So when I came on the scene in about 1980, when I was in graduate school, it was a time of enormous pessimism. There was a book called Limits to Growth. There's another book called The Population Bomb. We'd been through the problems of inflation during the 1970s. And it was really a time of doom and gloom, I think worse than anything people feel right now. And the message from economics tended to reinforce this pessimism. We live in a world of scarce objects. There's more and more people. We're using up the physical objects that we have. We're using up the carrying capacity of the atmosphere and the oceans. And the message seemed to be that life was destined to be on the decline going forward. Things would be worse and worse. Now, to me, this just was clearly wrong, both from the historical perspective and from the perspective of thinking about what the real possibilities are. So what I started working on was the parallel to the economics of objects that had been the preoccupation of economists for several centuries. I said, we've got to start thinking about the economics of ideas. It's the potential for discovering new ideas that makes growth possible still, and it's the process that's driven the accelerating process of growth we've seen if you look back over the centuries or the millennia. Things have been getting better. Things have been getting better on average at faster and faster rates. So there's every reason to expect this trend of improvement and progress to continue if we can continue to discover new ways to get value out of the scarce objects that we live with. So at the time, part of the message that I emphasized was that the market does more than just manipulate and transform physical objects. Market efforts, market incentives are critical to the development of new ideas, to innovation, so that when we think about the way forward, we can embrace the market both for the traditional reasons that economists have emphasized, how it manages and allocates these scarce objects, but also rely on it to encourage innovation. So if I use a headline from, say, 1997, as the tech boom was getting in gear, I was, held out as the kind of the spokesperson for this new vision of growth driven by new ideas, this optimistic vision. And to quote from myself, as quoted in that article, part of what I said was expressed skepticism about the role of the government. People wanted to try and use the new growth theory I was developing to argue for a much more expansive role for the government. And I was kind of distancing myself from that position. Okay, well, let's fast forward to 2021. Here's the headline from another, on the basis of another recent, more recent interview, where I'm articulating what seems like a diametrically opposite position. It says I'm calling for government activism, and there's some truth to that. So I've shifted my position and now think of the role of the government as being as important in sustaining progress as the role of the market. So what accounts for this kind of reversal over the course of the years from, say, the 1990s to the present? So what I want to do is set up this parallelism between things we can do through market mechanisms and things we can do through other mechanisms that are typically encouraged or supported by the government. But this language of the government versus the market is too loaded it kind of tips the scales in favor of the market, because nobody likes more government. So let me frame it in a slightly different way. I want to talk about open innovation, the kind of innovation that comes, for example, from science, the kind of innovation where we don't have strong property rights, we don't have billion-dollar unicorn businesses based on these new ideas, but these ideas still generate a huge amount of value. One example of this is the idea of what's known as oral rehydration therapy. When children suffer from cholera, it's usually dehydration that kills them. And the state of the art until just a few decades ago was that you had to get them into a hospital and get them on IV fluids to save their lives. Now, what somebody discovered in the field, and it was finally refined and perfected by somebody working in Bangladesh, was that if you, they knew, I should back up, they knew that if you just tried to give children who were getting dehydrated from this disease just water to drink, it didn't work. But what they discovered was that if you put some minerals, a little bit of salt, a little bit of potassium in the water, and then you add some sugar, the children can drink this solution and they can absorb it better, and you can save their lives without having to get them to a hospital, without having to rely on IV fluids. So this discovery, a recipe, an idea, just mix things that are available in the kitchen, a banana for some potassium, a little bit of salt, water, and then a little bit of sugar. And you give that to a child, you can save the child's life. So nobody has a patent on this idea. It's saved just tens of millions of lives, and it's improved the quality of life all over the planet. Now let's contrast that with something like new ways to enjoy music. Saving lives is good, but enjoying music, having pleasure in our lives is good too. When I was a child, my father had an amplifier and a stereo that played vinyl records. And this amplifier looked like a monster. It had vacuum tubes, it glowed orange, it was throwing off heat. You knew it was using up a huge amount of electricity to produce the music that I could listen to when my father played his records. Well, fast forward to the way we listen to music now. We have portable music players that use a tiny fraction of the electricity and make music available to us in ways that are much more convenient. We can have it with us. We can search through many more options more quickly. But the point I want to emphasize is the fact that it uses less electricity. Growth in value does not mean using more and more electricity, more and more steel, more and more aluminum. What it means is finding ways to get more value for us as people from smaller amounts of materials. And the modern music players, modern music is a perfect illustration of how we can have much more value from fewer raw materials. And it was a type of innovation that was driven by the market, or what I'll call proprietary innovation. People who were pushing these ideas wanted to make a profit, and this is another way to get innovation that improves the quality of life and gives us progress in the long run. So what we need now is to have a kind of balanced perspective on the roles of open innovation as opposed to proprietary or market-driven innovation. So one way that we've often thought about this is where science and the market lead, and science and the government lead, and then the market follows. So, for example, the U.S. government put up in orbit around the Earth the GPS satellites, and again, in this open perspective, just let the signal be available for free to anyone, and then other firms could figure out how to use mobile devices to read those GPS signals, and then to produce the kind of mobile maps that we're familiar with. So this fits that familiar pattern of kind of science and government subsidies moving first, then the market building on it, delivering products that we value. Another example that's probably less well recognized is that there were two open source operating systems. operating systems developed by people who gave the software away. One was called BSD, or the Berkeley Software Distribution. The other, better known, is Linux. When Apple decided to build its second generation of computers, they adopted the BSD operating system and built on that. When Google wanted to develop Android, they built it on top of Linux. So again, open innovation available to everyone was the foundation for the kinds of devices and computing possibilities that we enjoy now. So this helps us start to think about kind of a table I'll use of 4 different types of innovations. Some are both profitable and beneficial to society. Those are the ones we can count on the market to pursue. Some are harmful and not profitable. And again, the market does the right thing. We don't pursue them. But there are some that are beneficial, but not profitable, like investing in the early stages of development of an operating system, or investing in the GPS satellites. And so there's a natural role for the government to subsidize these things that are good, but that aren't profitable enough for market incentives to deliver. And this is a role for the government that most people are comfortable with. Of course, the government has to raise some tax revenue to provide these subsidies. But in terms of the direct intervention, subsidies are not so threatening. But now let's go to the next example that I'll use. There we go. Chemistry is obviously a field of science supported by governments all over the world for centuries now. One of the things that came out of chemistry were firms that developed specific types of chemicals. DuPont, I think, was the firm that developed a class of chemicals called chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. These seemed like, very beneficial chemicals. They could be used to extinguish fires in a gaseous form, so at a submarine or in a confined space, but they weren't harmful to human health. They were very safe. They had other uses. They were the gases we used in refrigerators, even the gases in aerosol spray cans. So again, it seemed like an example of something that was beneficial that the market developed based on principles of open science. But it turned out that the open science discovered that these chemicals were destroying the ozone layer. So now we have to think of a slightly different kind of role for the government. There are some new possibilities that turn out to be profitable. DuPont was making a profit selling CFCs, but that are actually harmful to society and harmful to everyone, to the planet. And what this forces us to recognize is that there's a role for a government which is a little less benign than just providing subsidies. Sometimes you have to have regulation. Sometimes you have to have governments that are strong enough to say no to the market participants. You can't do things that are profitable for you, because they may be profitable for you and your shareholders, but they're very harmful to society as a whole. So in the United States, under the Reagan administration, they took the lead in banning the CFCs and working towards a worldwide treaty where all countries agreed to ban CFCs, and the ozone layer has started to recover. And this has been critical to protecting the viability of life on Earth. So there's a different role, but one which is very important for the government. Now, let's think about two more recent examples. Wikipedia is a resource for everyone in the world. Their goal is to provide all the knowledge that exists at everyone's fingertips anywhere in the world. And it's available for free. It's provided by these open kind of systems of innovation, like science, like open source. I think it's been a huge benefit for the world. And then contrast that with the problem of indexing the web, just figuring out if you're going to go find some information from someplace on the web, who has something that's related to the question that you want to answer. Google was the first mover, well, not really the first mover, but the decisive winner in the race to be the firm that indexes the web. And it now makes profits. It has proprietary control over its knowledge about the web, and it makes enormous profits from that. And so we need to think about what are the benefits and costs of using something like the model of Wikipedia to make progress, and what are the benefits and costs of doing this through a firm like Google. As an investor, Wikipedia doesn't offer you any potential for big capital gains. So as an investor, you want to find the Googles, but we also want to think about, well, what's the background context in which all of the new potential firms, the new entrants are operating, and what's the context in which we all have to live? The perspective that this leads us to is one where we think not just of regulated private activity, but also kind of government supportive open innovation, where people other than firms can control technologies that might be harmful if they were misused. So we can think about not just subsidizing, say, science, but also subsidizing something like Wikipedia to use it as an alternative to having proprietary innovation. So the government can do things to encourage things which encourage proprietary innovation, or it can encourage things which preclude or preempt the proprietary innovation, as Wikipedia has done. Nobody can make a profit in the encyclopedia business anymore because Wikipedia is available to everyone for free. So the possibilities for the market have been shut down there. I think one of the biggest choices that all countries are going to have to grapple with in the coming decades is, how do we want to develop the potential behind artificial intelligence and machine learning? This could lead to firms that are new, that are analogous to Google, or it could literally be Google itself, which captures the proprietary control over many of these insights about machine learning and artificial intelligence. Or alternatively, it could be part of open science, open innovation, the way chemistry is, or the way that something like Wikipedia is. And the point that I want to turn to now is that you can create strong incentives for innovation in the market, but you can also get some very damaging side effects from relying on the market instead of relying on something like Wikipedia. So what are the types of harm? With the CFCs, we have the familiar problem of pollution, some kind of harmful effect, side effect on the environment. And we've understood for a long time that it's in our interests as citizens to have our government help us stop pollution so we can live in a safe and healthy, vibrant ecosystem. Financial market instability is another kind of harm that can come from, say, the proprietary innovation in financial instruments that led to the financial crisis of about around 2008-9. There's more direct threats to health and safety, like problems we've had in the United States with deaths from abuse of opioids. And then, of course, the pandemic, where the virus presents this very direct threat, where the government has a very important role to play, but the market too, in addressing it. Then monopoly is a potential harm that economists have focused on in the past. The usual harm we have in mind there is that a firm might charge too much. So it's too expensive to use a product that's under monopoly control. If one firm controlled the patent over the oral rehydration therapy, they might charge more for each parent to use it. And as a result, more children might die. But there's another threat that is becoming more obvious that goes beyond just the risk of prices that are higher because of monopoly than they would be in a competitive market. What we're seeing now is firms with monopoly positions over digital technologies that become so big that they're a threat. They can develop power which can threaten the power of governments. They can be so powerful that they undermine the principle of the rule of the law. The government may not, if these firms continue to become more and more powerful, may not be able to use regulation or legislation to control these firms because these firms are too powerful to control. And even more fundamentally, these firms can threaten an entire political system. That the mechanisms that nations use to guide their government and get the government to do things that are beneficial for citizens could be warped or taken over by firms that become too powerful, especially when they start to monopolize something like political advertising, which is central to the political process in many countries around the world. So the traditional approach to pollution and health threats from health and safety is regulation. A carbon tax is an example of a kind of regulation that's a price type regulation rather than a quantity regulation that we could use to try and deal with the threat of climate change. In financial market instability right now, we face questions about cyber currencies. Should we regulate? Should we disallow certain kinds of financial media for conducting transactions? And should we disallow or control certain kinds of new financial entities that are entering the scene? Already you can see here a version of this choice that I highlighted about AI. The government could take advantage of the possibilities of, say, cyber electronic transactions by having the central bank provide some kind of digital currency, digital transaction system. It wouldn't necessarily have to be provided by for-profit entities in the financial sector. In monopoly, there's greater awareness now of the role of merger review, where government agencies don't let the firms that already control a market buy up any new entrants to maintain their control. We may even see in some countries decisions to split up some of these companies that have already gotten too big. But at least in the West, these firms are so big and so powerful politically that it may not be possible to split them up and reduce their power through that mechanism. In this realm of digital advertising, one of the measures we could consider, which would be different from traditional regulation or government provision, would be more transparency. That any firm that's engaged in selling or is the intermediary that people use to send messages to people could be required to make transparent, make visible to everyone what all of the advertisements are, so that we have some public insight into what's going on with political advertisements in the democracies where political advertising is crucial to the outcome of elections. Now, I want to drill in a little bit on this choice between, say, the indexing the market by Google versus Wikipedia or some alternative model to provide something like digital services. The crucial decision in the history of Wikipedia that has made it so beneficial to society was a decision not to provide advertising on the site as a way to finance the work that people at Wikipedia did. Right now, it's financed mainly by donations from people who appreciate how valuable it is. Google, of course, pursued this other direction of advertising and targeted digital advertising. So different people see different ads based on a huge volume of information that Google collects about each person and that Google uses to then decide which ads that person sees. And also which videos they try and encourage that person to go look at, and more generally, firms are using this information to decide on recommendation systems that are finely tuned towards what the firms know about these individuals. So everybody is being treated differently in ways that are often not transparent to others, and for reasons that are not transparent, really as a means of trying to manipulate what they see, what they learn, what they know, and therefore get them to do things that lead to more profit using this advertising model. Now, this advertising model is a sharp departure from the way markets are supposed to work. When economists have talked about the value and the productivity of markets, we have in mind a system where buyers pay something to sellers, buyers pay to sellers, sellers deliver something, and then buyers can choose that if what they got wasn't as valuable to them as what they paid, they can choose to take their business elsewhere. None of these elements are operating in the markets for digital services we see, like the one for the search services that searching the web that Google offers. And so we shouldn't be surprised that market is misbehaving, is malfunctioning. It's not like the markets that have the good characteristics that we've seen in the past. And as I suggested, this approach leads to surveillance, a kind of a spying and surreptitious collection of information, and manipulation over manipulation of the decisions people make based on control over what they see, hear, and read, and who they hear from. So we're increasingly understanding that this is a very dangerous model for society, as a model that generates profits for potentially very powerful firms. And everything I've said about Google applies even more so to Facebook, because Facebook is an even bigger participant in the market for digital advertising. So a political candidate can send one message to one person, send a very different message to another person, and those inconsistencies are never revealed. Or someone acting on behalf of that candidate can send inflammatory information to some people but not others, and polarize and divide a nation that needs to make decisions about what course it wants to pursue in the future. So the suggestion I've proposed here that goes beyond just our traditional measures of regulation, our traditional notions of government provision, but that is actually very close to the idea of a carbon tax, is simply that governments tax the revenue from digital advertising. A firm like Google or Facebook, which collects tens of billions of dollars per year in revenue from digital advertising, would have to pay a tax on the proceeds that it earns from that type of business. Now, this is a very different tax from the corporate income tax, because companies can move income between jurisdictions, but the revenue they collect from selling ads in a particular jurisdiction is tied to that jurisdiction. So we don't have this problem of kind of corporate income, which migrates to the lowest tax jurisdiction, the so-called race to the bottom. And it means that each jurisdiction could decide, do we want to tax digital advertising? And if so, at what kind of rate? So states in the United States could do it, different governments could do it, and they can all select their own rate. I think it would also be a good idea to make this tax progressive. The bigger the firm is, the higher the tax rate is, because this creates incentives for big firms to voluntarily separate themselves. Under this kind of a tax system, if Google were to spin out if Facebook were to spin out Instagram so that Facebook and Instagram were separate companies, its total tax bill would be substantially lower under a progressive tax system, because you'd have two firms taxed at a lower rate rather than the single firm taxed at the higher rate. So this would give us a kind of an automatic stabilizer that puts some limits on how big these companies can become. And a high tax rate on digital advertising will also encourage these firms to go back to the more traditional business model. If Google wants to provide search services to someone like me, they could charge $1 a month, $4 a month for me to take advantage of Google's search services, and I'd probably pay that much to get search from Google. But of course, I might shop around and see if there's somebody who's giving me better search options. So there's no reason why digital services can't be provided by something like a subscription mechanism that gets us back to the kinds of markets that were traditional, kinds of markets that worked well for society, kinds of markets that didn't pose these really, frightening threats to surveillance, control, manipulation, undermining of the political system, and fostering animosity, because animosity is what keeps people online longer and means that they're available to see more ads. A service like Netflix or Spotify that provides something to you for a subscription price, they don't want to try and force you to spend more time online. But a service that's serving up ads, they want to do whatever they have to keep you glued to the service, using it more. And one of the reliable ways they found to keep people online more is to get them involved in arguments. So this gives you some idea of the magnitudes just in the United States. Google, this is for 2021, under the tax that I'm proposing that could get up as high as, say, a 30 to 40% average tax rate on income. Google could pay something like 18 billion a year in tax on revenues of almost 60 billion a year. Facebook would pay about 14.5 billion, and again, this is just on revenues in the United States. To show you how concentrated this market is, the third biggest firm, Amazon, is less than a third, or about a third, the size of Facebook and Google. It would only pay 2 billion a year. Microsoft is next. It would pay just about 100 million a year. And all the other firms that you can think of, like Twitter, wouldn't pay anything under this tax because there'd be a very generous zero bracket exemption. So there are a bunch of orange dots there that represent the other players in this market who would have a zero tax rate under the system I've proposed. So this shows you how concentrated this market is, and shows you that when you're facing billions of dollars a year in potential taxes, these firms would have incentives to split themselves apart and to start relying more on something like subscription charges, so they could be profitable the way Microsoft is, by charging for subscriptions rather than the way they are now, where it's entirely based on advertising. So let me just conclude by coming back to this point of optimism that I had when I entered the scene in the 1990s. I think there are still grounds for enormous optimism. Historically, much of the value that a nation could control came from its control over land or physical resources like factories. And in that kind of world, there was a temptation for one nation to try and invade another to acquire more land. But because the new economy is driven by the economics of ideas, conquest is a losing proposition. It's not a way for a nation to get rich. We saw this with the Soviet Union, where the nations it had occupied, like East Germany, ended up being a burden for Russia rather than a benefit to them. So war will be a much less common phenomenon, I think, going forward. And one of the great things about ideas is that nations can share in the benefits of new ideas generated anywhere in the world. So this turns us it turns us away from being rivals towards being collaborators. That new insights about how to control a virus, how to make vaccines, can actually end up benefiting everybody. So And the challenges facing nations are very similar. Every nation wants to be able to enforce the rule of law. Every nation wants to protect its markets from firms that become so powerful that they undermine the rule of law or threaten political stability. Different nations will pursue different paths, but instead of thinking of a kind of a contest or rivalry, these nations are really in very similar positions, despite their many other differences. And so there will be many opportunities for nations to cooperate as they all pursue progress. So to reemphasize why there's this optimism, it's because it's ideas, not objects, that are the key to progress. That's as true now as it was in the 1990s. And there are many ways to produce and distribute and share new ideas. And we shouldn't just think about the existing harmful market models that we see now. We could have different market models like subscriptions, or even models that look more like Wikipedia and open source. All of these together can produce ideas and lead to a higher quality of life. So progress remains possible. Progress for everybody remains possible if a nation can maintain both an innovative market that does some of the innovation that we want to see, and if it has a government which is strong enough to say no when the market is causing harm, and strong enough to encourage something else as another way to sustain innovation and progress. Thanks.